Well, thank you, Magda. And thank you to everyone at the World Affairs Council in Seattle for inviting me to host. I've been planning for this event since receiving the invitation, and I'm really excited to hear from our experts today. So I'm going to go ahead and launch us into a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll start with some questions from our panelists. So the very first game of the FIFA World Cup is going to be Mexico versus South Africa, and that's going to be on June 11th, played in Mexico City. And as we begin our discussion of sport, influence, and mega events on the global stage, we would like to begin by covering some terms and topics that might be familiar to some of you, but maybe not to everyone in our in our audience. So today we're focusing on mega sports events. That is those large global sporting events like the recent Winter Games in Italy, and then, of course, the FIFA World Cup. An important distinction between the Olympics and the World Cup is hosted by one federation, FIFA, the Federation Internationale of Football. The Olympic Games are hosted by the International Olympic Committee, and then there are dozens of sports federations all contributing to the event. So whether it's a single sporting event like the French Open that's coming up in tennis that will draw global attention, or a mega event like the Women's World Cup in 2027, clever terms like ping pong diplomacy and diplomats in tracksuits capture the public's attention. However, in the run-up to the 2026 FIFA World Cup, terms like sports diplomacy, sports washing, and soft power are often used to capture these assumptions around the political and economic games, and then also the social and cultural exchange of these mega events. Today, we're also going to use the terms soccer and football interchangeably. But as we begin our comments today and our work with our panelists, we wanted to give you all kind of a quick explainer on some of these terms. So Lindsay, can you offer a quick description on sports diplomacy and how it operates in relation to other forms of diplomacy and its association with these mega sports events?
Sure, of course. So, sports diplomacy, kind of the very classic textbook definition, is that sports diplomacy happens when the three acts of diplomacy, communication, representation, and negotiation, intersect and occur in and around the sporting terrain, whether it's on the court or off the court, and results in a cultural exchange, knowledge exchange, or technical exchange, right? So that there's this kind of give and receive sort of two-way street motion. So that's a very clinical definition, but what does it really mean in real life? Sports diplomacy, it's a people project. It is a way to convene people, to facilitate conversations that sometimes might not happen in most other environments if it wasn't through the prism of sport. It's a way to learn a little bit something about the other, whoever else you're engaging with, as well as a little something about yourself. And so I always tell my students, sports diplomacy is it's like a Swiss Army knife for sporting and international relations. Yes, it can be used by governments and state credentialed representatives, whether they're host cities, whether they're heads of states or government credentialed diplomats and ambassadors, or kind of under this formal sports diplomacy prism, whether oftentimes that can be elite athletes competing for their nation in an Olympiad or in a FIFA or FIBA World Cup tournament, when they're literally physical embodiments of the nation. But sports diplomacy is also conducted by what we call non-state sports actors. And that effectively means everyone else who is not an official government credentialed representative. So that can be international federations like FIFA or the International Olympic Committee. That can mean national sports federations, right? The national sports governing bodies, professional teams and leagues, collegiate level teams, leagues, athletes, coaches, sponsors, media. People like you and me, right? So non-state sports actors, that's kind of that everyone else bucket. And, today in the 2020s, thanks to our internet connected, social media driven, globalized, global sports ecosystem, the vast majority of sports diplomacy today is conducted by these non-state sports actors, by everyone else within the sporting ecosystem. And so, sports diplomacy can do things like help stimulate trade and tourism. It can help in terms of nation branding or, helping to shift national narratives and understandings at the international level. It can help to reinforce commerce and tourism and business development. It can be used to stimulate and drive greater fan engagement internationally based on what your sporting organization or entity is. Yes, it can be a tool used towards more altruistic things like fomenting greater peace and understanding. But it can also be about fomenting better team chemistry within a team with international players or personnel, and getting to know each other well enough so that you can play together as a unit and drive towards those more specific, maybe less altruistic goals, like creating a championship season, for example. So sports diplomacy can be all of these things. There is no one blueprint, and I think that's what makes it both really exciting, but also maybe a little hard to grasp initially.
Yeah, yes, thank you. So among the many terms around sports diplomacy, some folks would refer to some of the tools of sports diplomacy as you have around those economic benefits and those cultural benefits, both within the nation and then, one nation in relation to others. Could you help us understand a couple of other terms? One that keeps coming up is sports washing. And can you help us understand what that is? And then also a lot of folks use the term soft power, but it's not universally accepted as the kind of the appropriate way to be thinking about sports diplomacy or diplomacy in general. So help us understand sports washing. And then what are
Sure.
your thoughts on soft power?
Sure. So I should say at the forefront that I don't use the term sports washing. It is supposed to be a term designated for when countries invest in sports to kind of whitewash their human rights or civil rights abuses. Um, I do not use the term, and this is a newer term that's only kind of been in our vocabulary since probably 2017, 2018. I do not use the term because it is historically, up until maybe very recently, only applied towards non-Western countries or countries in the global south, whether it's China, Russia, Rwanda, the Gulf countries of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, and never applied towards other countries, whether the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK, France, Italy, other countries who maybe, yes, that could be part of it. So one reason why I don't use the term sports washing is that it's not applied evenly and equally across the board. The second reason that I don't use the term sports washing is that when you look at the countries that have been kind of accused by Western media or Western narratives of engaging in sports washing, particularly, say, Qatar or Saudi Arabia, when you look at their published foreign policy, missions that describe their use of sports diplomacy, they're very clear about the reasons why they're investing in sports and engaging through sports diplomacy. And there are different versions of one trying to create and diversify their economies away from the natural gas and oil, right? The petrofuels, and towards a broader, more diverse economy, understanding that the future of their economies is not going to be based on oil and gas. And I think we've kind of seen what that means in real time over the last few months. So building a sports economy, whether through hosting events, sponsoring events, attracting different kinds of sporting teams and building that, these are different ways to diversify their economies. Two, it's a way for them to create future job sectors for their significant youth bulge. When you look at where the bulge of the world's demographics are, where we're on the cusp of kind of the youth bulge going into kind of the professional markets, it's in the Middle East, especially the Gulf countries, as well as Africa. So, these countries are looking at their sports investment as not just a way to diversify economies, but also to help to create jobs for that next generation who are aging into the job market. Three, they're also investing in sports to help to combat their significant and rapidly rising obesity rates, right? To get people moving. to encourage them to engage in sports at a variety of different levels. If you can't see it, you can't really be it, right? This is part of Saudis thinking of really stimulating their professional soccer leagues on the men's side, but also on the women's side, and trying to provide these kind of examples close to home that younger kids are trying to emulate. So when you look at the reasons why they have, publicly stated behind their investments in sports, they're very clearly not doing it to whitewash their international reputations, despite some of the very real civil and human rights, controversies that are there, as those controversies also exist in Western countries as well. Um, and I think the last thing I'll just say on that is that Qatar, especially, certainly has not gone about its sports diplomacy efforts with the idea to divert global attention from itself. If anything, and we saw that in the lead up to and in the aftermath of it hosting Qatar FIFA 2022, anything that put it even more under a global microscope and did force it to start to enact policy changes that um, are they this to the same standards as other Western countries today? No, but are they more than what had been previously? So prior to 2010, 2011, are they better than that? Yes. So there's also that.
Yeah. Thank you, Lindsay. Ron, I want to invite you into the conversation and share some of your thoughts about what you've heard from Lindsay around these terms, sports diplomacy, sports washing, and its contested use, and then also how should we be thinking about soft power?
Yeah, fantastic. And thank you so much for having me. Really, I'm pleased to be part of this conversation. Just building on what Lindsay was just saying, I think a couple elements of that are really important. One is this idea that sports diplomacy in many instances can actually do something that maybe more formal forms, more state actor forms of diplomacy have a harder time doing. You mentioned ping pong diplomacy, which is sort of the famous example people often give, but it's a great example of where the Chinese and the US governments were struggling to speak with each other on any kind of formal level, and it sort of opened up a pathway through sports. So I think that's one of the possibilities sports diplomacy offers. I think and I really appreciate Lindsay's comments about sports washing. I think it's absolutely true that it's been applied unevenly and sort of as a cudgel by media in the global north against countries in the global south. I think it's interesting that you are now starting to hear people asking the questions of sports washing in the global north sort of for the first time. And you can tell, to Lindsay's point, you can tell it doesn't quite fit because people sort of struggle to like, well, is it sports washing exactly? And that what you're hearing there, I think, is often the fact that it is applied very specifically to sort of discourses of the global south. And so rethinking, trying to broaden that question to human rights across the board or other kinds of social justice issues across the board is really, really important. I think the idea of soft power is really this idea of, basically any form of attraction, ability to attract people to your nation, your nation's ideals, what your nation's symbols through different forms of diplomacy. And so sports diplomacy is a good example of that. So hard power would be more related to force, more related to sort of the stick as opposed to the carrot, as it were. And soft power, the idea behind it is really the carrot, trying to sort of put forward the best face. And I think it's important when we think about soft power to, especially with the World Cup coming up, to think about it not just as something that nation states do, but also the way a host city attempts to do that, or the state of Washington attempts to do that. Those are all different attempts to sort of get on the world stage, put forward a good face, attract people, attract tourism, attract business, attract investment, that sort of thing. I'll also just introduce one other term, which I think is interesting and relates to what Lindsay was just talking about with Qatar specifically. So Brannigan and Giulianotti, two scholars, talk about soft disempowerment. And that's exactly that idea of what happens if you attempt to use soft power and it backfires. And I think you could argue that's part of what we saw with Qatar. I think the hosting of the 2022 World Cup actually brought a great deal of attention to their human rights issues. It creates an interesting dynamic. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was a net loss or sort of on the sort of overall picture that they wouldn't do it again. I think they would. But it is interesting to think about ways that attempts at soft power can backfire, particularly if they're read as disingenuous or, as the term sports washing and for sort of trying to cover something up, trying to be inauthentic, trying to sort of, hide things and distract things. I think that's part of what's happening there.
Yeah.
And if I
Thank you so
could,
much. Oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
if I could maybe just tag on, soft power, in, which is so often how we talk through that prism when we talk about soft diplomacy. I would suggest, and many others are starting to say this as well, that there's nothing soft about sports. When you look at also the economic power that is there behind some forms of sports diplomacy, particularly hosting or other things. There is this question: is it more than just soft power? Is it maybe sports power, which kind of sits between that soft power of attraction and kind of more traditional forms of hard power, coercion by military or economic force, right? Kind of so thinking about in today's world with the global sports economy, which is in the trillions, maybe we should be talking about it as yes, soft power, but also something more.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Thank you so much. It's really great to hear the kind of the real intricacies of these terms that get tossed around in the public discourse. So this is really great setup for thinking about our conversation. Um, I'm imagining an event from the bidding process that happened nearly 10 years ago, and how swiftly things have changed until this point. And then, of course, the games will continue, and there'll be some legacy events after. But in terms of that bidding process, can you help us understand what are the motivations for a host nation to bid on a mega sports event, and how there is this shift from more Northern Hemisphere, Westernized nations to the Southern Hemisphere nations, both bidding and hosting? And so, Lindsay, could you talk a little bit more? Could you dive a little deeper into some of the political and power interests for those countries that are bidding on and then hosting those events? And then in particular, help us understand how you've mentioned Qatar, and how it's a country that has bid once, or at least hosted once. And then put that in contrast to France, who just in the last, the stretch of around 6 to 8 years, bid on and will host the Summer Olympic Games in 2024, the 2027 Men's FIBA World Cup, and then we'll turn around and host the Winter Games in 2020-30. So how do we imagine the countries like Qatar that are getting involved in this the first time, and then countries that have done this repeatedly, and what are those political and power interests across those two examples?
Oh, good examples. And I'll get into it. So, kind of starting very generally, there's a variety of different reasons why countries want to bid to host sporting mega events, not just in an Olympic and Paralympic Games or a FIFA World Cup, but FIBA World Cup, international volleyball World Cups, right? All of these international federations have their version of World Cups or World Championships. And there are different interests that go into it. But one of the primary driving ones is trying the hoped economic impact that it will have by not just in terms of drawing sports tourism for those events, but also perhaps investment in infrastructure that might be needed to help to support that event, whether it's refurbishing or building stadiums or highways, right? That was a big thing with South Africa. It wasn't in 2010, it was not just the stadiums, they were also building the highways, the infrastructure, new modern airports to welcome all the visitors, upgrades and things such as Wi-Fi and broadband internet capabilities, telecom systems. So there's a lot of different impacts that can go into political calculations for why to bid on hosting events. And there are some countries like France that since the rollout of their official sports diplomacy policy in 2013, have made trying to bid and hosting sporting mega events one of their pillars in terms of the economic impact, the tourism that it brings, the continued political will to keep up the current infrastructure, and other sorts of political things. The one of the main draws in terms of legacy impact, but also part of the bid process for Paris 2024 was a major investment in upgrading and updating its public transit system, which we've already started to see the first kind of wave of that, and it continues with the building of many different new metro stops and subway lines across the system, thereby better connecting the outlying suburban areas to the urban core, and trying to transcend a lot of the social economic divides that are there. So that's just one example. Other countries also take into that calculus what hosting can do for their national brand reputation in terms of making it advertising it as an attractive place to do business or to have investments. And those are kind of two of the main ones. Also, international bragging rights, right? That you're able to host and organize a large, complex international tournament like that can also be part of that calculus. So those are some of the main ones, and there's, I'm sure, other ones that I might not immediately come to mind, but maybe Ron has some of those also at the tip. The comparison of Qatar and Paris and France is interesting because, to your point, sometimes these go in waves. And so Qatar hosted FIFA 2022, but also some more regional international events. I think they recently hosted the International Handball World Cup. They're hosting FIBA Men's World Cup in 2027 before that tournament goes to France in 2031. There are certainly conversations around doing an Olympic bid at some point. So it's not just that they did one and done, it's part of kind of their ongoing, strategy and metric, right? In terms of hosting, being known as a able, capable, willing, and attractive host. And when you speak to when I speak to a lot of people who did go to Qatar for World Cup 2022 or some of the other tournaments they've held, before and since then, they say how great it was that everything was, very updated, modern infrastructure, that they were able to get around very easily on the new transportation system, that they were able to see more than one game at one stadium in a day, that accessibility, that, the teams were all pretty much close together rather than continents apart. So there are some of those considerations as well. For France, they are in the middle of a cycle of hosting sporting mega events, which started actually with co-hosting Eurobasket in 2015, the football championship in 2016. Paris 2024 was kind of their big push, but to your point, Jennifer, that they're still hosting the Winter Games in 2030, FIBA Men's World Cup 2031. And so forth. So both are examples of countries invested in hosting for different aims and different ends. The last part I'll add to that, and then Ron, please do jump in here, is that you think about the aftermath of hosting an event and the knowledge that your sports officials and administrators and organizers have. You can then kind of sell that knowledge or use that knowledge in helping others. So it's kind of like a multiplying effect. For example, those who were intricate in getting the London 2012 Olympic bid and then hosting have, since, gone on and helped and advised others, right? And so there's kind of that passing of the baton that you've now developed the knowledge and the expertise to organize and host these events. Here's how you can help others who are, coming up down the line.
Yeah. Thank you, Ron. Anything you want to add on there? I also have another question for you about this.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, all I would say is just really to emphasize that last point Lindsay made, I think is really crucial. I would actually mark the start of the The French cycle is hosting the World Cup in 1998. And sometimes, sometimes it takes a while to sort of kick in, but I do think that that knowledge base that you build up, there's such complex events to pull off. They take such coordination and so many different moving parts that if you figure out how to do it well, you want to do it again.
Yeah.
And even
Yeah.
if you figure out sort of what didn't go well, you want to give it another shot. So I think it's not a coincidence that we see places repeating because of that built up knowledge. I also think the other thing you hear in what Lindsay is talking about is those nations or host cities or whatever it is that really have a strategy around developing this over the long term are the ones that both succeed the first time and want to keep doing it because they do have that larger vision and that larger idea of what the benefits will be. And I think the sort of straight up vanity projects that are sort of one-offs don't quite fly as well. And I think that's why you don't see some of them repeating in the same way. You don't see Russia, for instance, repeating after hosting the World Cup, at least not yet.
Yeah, no, that's really really helps me understand, when I was looking up these different events. There's actually one more in France, and it was the Women's World Cup that was also in
Right.
that same time
2019,
cycle.
yeah. Yeah.
So it really helps me understand how that success really sort of continues to perpetuate future success, and how that might influence those investments and the longer term economic benefits. But we do know that in the last cycle of awarding the Olympic Games, that the Olympic Committee elected to award two sets of games in that award cycle. And during that award cycle, they awarded the 2024 Summer Olympics and the 2028 Olympics. But in that bid process, the initial five, there were more cities than five cities that had started the process, but they pulled out as it got closer and closer to the awarding. So is there any thoughts about why a city or a community might elect not to bid or to stay out of the bidding process, either for a particular event or just the mega events overall? Oh,
Yeah, I can
Ron.
jump. Sure, I can jump in quickly on that, but I would love to hear what Lindsay has to say as well. I mean, I think we are seeing this more and more. I think part of it is as these mega events one are becoming more common with the growth of sports in many ways. It used to be that you'd talk about mega events essentially as the Olympics and the Men's World Cup. Now you're talking about a lot more events involved in that, so there's a lot more opportunity, but it also means that there's maybe a little bit less scarcity than there once was. And I don't know if any of you have seen the contracts that a host city has to sign to gain one of the to be a host city, but it's extensive and it gives a great deal of power away from the host city. And so I think more and more you do see host cities really hesitating to take that jump, sort of. And then I think the other thing you see, at least in this World Cup, and I'm much more familiar with the World Cups than the Olympics, you do see many of the costs being shifted onto localities. And so those localities are understandably much more hesitant to take on those costs because they are significant and the cost benefit analysis changes. We saw that with Vancouver initially trying to withdraw from the bidding process for the 2026 World Cup, and then being sort of, I don't know if strong-armed is quite the right word, but strongly encouraged to keep their bid going, so that there'd be more than one city in Canada to uphold sort of Canada's end of the bid. So I do think cities are becoming more hesitant about what to commit and at least want to have more guarantees that they'll have greater support in doing it. I also think you see very different approaches in the different federations to how they approach hosts. And I think, FIFA is a very strong, very powerful organization. So they've been a place where they can sort of say, well, if you want this, they had a very strong bargaining position. Not every federation is in as strong of a bargaining position, and so it means that looks a little different.
Yeah, well, those are great comments, and it helps us segue from that bidding process to the hosting. And to your point, Ron, the amount of money and what's given up in exchange for the costs at the local level. So the US is actually hosting the Men's World Cup this summer for the second time. But Seattle, as a host city, this will be our first time hosting this event. And it is a united bid, as you mentioned, between Canada, US, and Mexico. But it was 2018 when the bid was awarded. And many promises were eventually codified into contracts and agreements between FIFA, the countries, the host cities, their football federations. Estimates for the World Cup costs this year are, I've heard everything from 12 to $13 billion to host 48 teams, 104 matches in 16 cities across our three North American host nations. Just imagining the fuel costs and the logistics. It's quite spread out. Seattle investments are estimated at $32 million to host our 6 matches. So Ron, can you explain a little bit more? You had talked about those contracts. Could you explain a little bit more about how FIFA controls these finances, particularly around media rights, licensing agreements, ticketing prices, and some of the assumptions or maybe misunderstood assumptions about the economic benefits to Seattle as we host these games?
Sure. It's a very complex sort of web of relationships, but I can start to sort of try to untangle it a bit. I think the biggest misperception is that FIFA is sort of a single, and I should say, let me put it this way. The biggest misperception is that the organizers of the tournament are a single organization. Because you have FIFA International, which runs soccer globally. You have FIFA 2026, which is based in Miami and is running the tournament.
Mhm.
Then you have local organizing committees in each of the 16 host cities. And then that's not even counting all sorts of other folks who are organizing different sort of pieces of the pie. So for instance, in Seattle, they've sort of devolved the Fan Fest into separate events, and different organizations are taking on each of those under the aegis of the local organizing committee. So what that means is, one, there has to be an immense amount of communication going on across different layers of organization. And two, it also means that oftentimes people might get mad about one thing and then direct it at an organization that has nothing to do with it. For instance, ticket prices, our local organizing committee can't do a thing about ticket prices. That's controlled by FIFA. So, to your question about sort of what FIFA controls, what other folks control. So FIFA controls the everything inside the stadiums, but not everything outside of the stadium. So the prime example for that in Seattle is the upcoming Pride match. That Pride match was both organized and is sort of being named as such, not by FIFA, but by the local organizing committee. And so the local organizing committee will have sort of events and moments around the match that recognize pride, but FIFA inside the stadium and the teams competing, which in the draw ended up being in Egypt and Iran, don't have to recognize that in any way, shape, or form. So that's an example where it sort of comes like there are different angles of it. And then just to your point about the economic benefits, I mean, I think the crucial question to ask is not just what are the economic benefits, but who gets the economic benefits. So, for instance, FIFA controls all the broadcasting rights, which is by far, it literally funds all of FIFA's work over the next 4 years. The international broadcasting rights are immense. They also control the ticketing, a lot of the hospitality, like different pieces of that. So that's where much of the economic revenue is generated. That doesn't necessarily stay in host cities. Obviously, tourism industries hope to gain a lot of that economic wealth. Security is actually the biggest price tag for host cities. So Seattle will spend the most on security, and then facilities, upgrades to transportation, all sorts of other stuff as well. But the security costs are immense, and that's one of the biggest sort of touch points between FIFA and local organizing committees is the cost of security. So I think the question really is to ask not the question of like what are the big numbers of what the economic impact will be, but how does that economic impact actually get distributed? Where does it go? Who benefits? Who loses? Those kinds of questions.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to shift that, how we should be thinking about those economic benefits. Lindsay, I want to bring you into this part of the conversation. Is there any anecdotes, either from your region around transportation or ticket pricing? Because I also have some other questions to ask you about sort of the displacement of economic benefits when an event like this comes to town.
So, both in the New York, New Jersey area where I'm normally based, as well as in Boston, where I presently am joining you guys from right now, the cost of round trip public transit out to the stadiums is a real hot button issue. I think in Boston, it's what, $85 round trip to take the commuter rail from Boston City Center out to Foxborough, which is the location of Boston Stadium, which is like an hour outside of the city, right? For New York, New Jersey to get to take Jersey Transit round trip from New York City out to the stadium and back is now, I think, at $105, whereas normally it's around $13 or less round trip. So there's been uh, significant conversations around that, and gets to Ron's point that one of the biggest, price tags for the hosts is security, but also the unusual transportation solutions that they have to come up with because when you look at all of these stadiums, the vast majority of these stadiums are normally NFL stadiums, and not all, but most of them are not constructed within easy access of most public transit, in metro urban areas. They're out in suburban areas or places where you cannot walk to it, right? You need to take some form of a vehicle to get to. So it creates a real problem for those who are trying to organize transit solutions.
No, I think your point about that cost being pushed to the local citizens really to
Locals, yeah.
pay that fare that jumps from $13 to $113. That's a real cost that gets pushed on to the local citizens who may not even be engaging in the events themselves. It also makes me think about the ways that an event comes into town, like the FIFA event, and the ways that the contracts have been established that our local Lumen Field is going to be called Seattle Stadium. And in Los Angeles, there's a similar circumstance where you've got the SoFi Stadium being renamed the Los Angeles field or stadium, and yet it's not even in Los Angeles, it's in Inglewood. And so the municipality of Inglewood is, managing some of these displaced costs. But the other thing about the Los Angeles example that I think is important for our conversation is the ways that the leadership of FIFA, so Gianni Infantino, helps set these contracts for the licensing and the naming of the stadiums. And yet the workers within the stadium, particularly at SoFi, their local union has been trying to bargain around worker rights, so garnishing wages that was set to happen during the events. Ron, you mentioned some of the hospitality contracts and whatnot. But those workers are also bargaining and negotiating around ICE detentions, prohibiting ICE being on site, and then also the credentialing that the workers had to go through to be part of the event as a FIFA event and giving up that personal information. And so on the one hand, the FIFA leadership is setting these contracts for the stadiums and the event, and yet the workers who have actually decided to vote on a strike next week, how should we view the role of Gianni Infantino in this hosting of the event where you've got control over the licensing, and what should be his role, or what should we be looking for him to protect the rights of the workers at the stadiums themselves? Oh, and Ron, would you like to go ahead and take this one first?
Sure. Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question, and I think it's an interesting example, especially for Seattle, because we do have some of the most progressive labor laws in the country, and you see that kicking in terms of protecting workers in some ways that workers, for instance, in Los Angeles. At the Azteca in Mexico City, other places don't have those protections. So I think one thing you're seeing is the ways in which the a mega event brings to the fore differences in these kinds of protections and different kinds of policies that are in place. We were talking about Qatar and workers' rights earlier. So part of what these events do is sort of highlight the differences, not only the similarities. From place to place. That said, for sure, FIFA is very controlling about many of the things that can happen. I know the local organizing committee was talking about some attempts they were making to do things around the airport, but their contract had precluded them from being able to do that. So, and that's outside Seattle, so it's outside some of the other laws. So, it's a great example of the different ways those contracts codify the ability of FIFA to run things on their terms, even when that's different than what the normal local terms are. But it doesn't necessarily mean they can violate local laws. So those local laws become even more important. The other thing I'll just mention about the way that sort of, you're mentioning the renaming of the stadiums and that sort of thing. Part of what that does is it means that the money for sponsorship, FIFA can sell their sponsorship at much higher levels and gain much more income. When those costs get devolved to local organizing committees, it means local organizing committees can't sell sponsorships in competition. So, for instance, Coca-Cola is one of the main sponsors of FIFA globally. That means that the local organizing committee can't have a sponsor of even a local soda company because they're seen as in competition with FIFA sponsor, and the FIFA sponsors, the overall sponsors, trump pardon the pun, the local organizing and their attempts at fundraising. So not only is the local organizing committee having to foot the bill for more things than they have in the past, they're also a little hamstrung by their ability to raise money by these deals.
Yeah, yeah. And it just makes me think about SoFi or Lumen. They're also foregoing those branding rights during that period of the games. We do have a question along these lines from someone in our audience, and they're asking how the local organizing committees negotiate their goals and ideas. So we've talked about this a little bit, but maybe there's a real example, perhaps a little bit more around the Pride match and how if I'm the president of our local organizing committee or one of the staff on our local organizing committee, how does that negotiation happen for things like the Pride match?
Yeah, so I can say for those of you interested, particularly in the Pride match, on Monday night we'll be having a session specifically on that as part of our speaker series at UW, and we'll go from the Pride match to broader questions of sort of LGBTQIA plus rights protection in the World Cup and beyond. But I think it is a great example because what you see there is FIFA is really invested in making sure that the game experience on television is as uniform as possible. So you'll get, aerial shots of the stadium, you'll get aerial shots of the city, but they want you to be able to watch the game and feel like that game is a consistent product across the board. So the controls in the stadium will look very different than across the rest of the city. What that does do is it actually gives the local organizing committee more freedom to do what they want to do in the rest of the city. So, for instance, when the Egyptian and Iranian football associations protested the Pride match and the fact that they had been drawn, the Pride match had been announced long before the draw. So there wasn't an expectation that it would land on Egypt and Iran as the two teams. It was because it's Pride weekend here in Seattle. But because that's organized by the local organizing committee, it actually does give them freedom to continue to do the events that they're planning to do because they aren't reliant on FIFA to run them, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for giving us a little bit more context about that. Let's continue, with the matches themselves, but shift our conversation a little bit back to those global politics. So again, when Seattle and the rest of the North American nations received our bid in 2026 for this FIFA World Cup, the global political order and aims of sports diplomacy have really shifted. Among the consistent concerns are many of the topics that we've touched on a bit for these mega sports events, impacts to the climate, weather events that might happen that are going to impact both the spectators and the athletes during the games themselves, freedom of expression, human rights, and we talked a little bit about worker rights, Lindsay, can you help us think about how FIFA, as a diplomatic non-state actor, has a role in how we should understand some of the games and what's happening now in real time? So Ron mentioned the Egypt game versus Iran. The Iranian team is now staying off of U.S. soil for their training, but then they'll be traveling to U.S. So can you help us understand how should we understand this from the perspective of sports diplomacy? How should we understand these broader political and geopolitical concerns in this moment?
Well, that's a really good question. I think, first of all, understanding FIFA 2026 as perhaps the largest example of sports diplomacy in action that we will have seen to date, and probably, quite frankly, for some time, because of all of these issues, because it's across three different co-hosts, right? As well as 16 different host cities, each with their own, particularly because we're talking about different states and regions, each with their own different layers of governance and policy that are different. It's different from, say, Qatar or France, where it's pretty centralized policy and you don't have to cut through all of those various different layers in quite the same way. So, yeah, this is going to be a very big, interesting, although complicated sports diplomacy show for sure. And I think what it does is it does help to bring into greater relief, I think, particularly for North American audiences that maybe might not be as focused usually on other parts of the world as some of the geopolitics that follows some of these teams in, for sure. That being said, however, FIFA World Cup is a very unique stage because it is the biggest, most watched global event. Not that the Olympic and Paralympic Games are not, but there are so many different sporting disciplines. I saw research in terms of the engagement around the last FIFA Men's World Cup final. So the matchup between Argentina and France in Qatar 2022. The research shows that 1 in 2 people in the world, so half of the world, was engaged and watching that final and that one game, right? We don't see that in the Olympic and Paralympic Games in the same way. So because of that, it's a very powerful and unique platform. And it does provide the national teams that are participating a very unique platform and way to help to either reinforce certain narratives that are out there about their country and their football culture on an international level, or help to reshape and shift narratives. Here, I think particularly of countries like Haiti, which usually when we hear about Haiti in the news, it's usually not for terribly positive news stories, right? There's a lot of political, economic, social, real issues there. However, Haiti qualified for a World Cup the first time since 1974. And how they're using that platform to help engage the rest of the world as well as local North American publics about Haiti, its diaspora, its people, and its football, and kind of the hope that it stands for. And we saw some of the starting with they had some athletes at the Winter Paralympic and Winter Games. So, there's also that part of it as well.
Yeah, thank you for helping us think about how we should be thinking about these games. And it gets me thinking about the local influence that the FIFA World Cup will have not only on our own team's performance, but how that conversation and that discourse can shift with the teams that are coming here. Ron, do you have some comments about how we should think about the current geopolitical moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll just add, I love what Lindsay just said. And I think, as in any situation where people to people diplomacy is taking place, I think it's sort of the World Cup is sort of that on steroids. Like it's such a powerful moment of people to people diplomacy in lots of different ways. And so thinking about how people make meaning of it becomes really, really crucial, I think. And then I also think, and I've been trying to think of a counterexample and I haven't yet. To my knowledge, it's the first time a mega event has combatants where one in a geopolitical war where combatants of one nation are actually traveling to the host
Yeah.
country of the other nation in the combat. And so I think that's really quite a remarkable moment. And Lindsay, you might know of an example I haven't been able to think of yet where that's happened before. But it's different than two combatants going to a neutral site, a third site. So I think it'll be super interesting to watch what happens. And as I said before, I think it just sort of puts in high relief the issues we're already seeing in international relations. So, for instance, the South African team being denied their visas to transit to Mexico for their first match and being delayed to get there. I mean, there's so many different levels on which we're seeing the politics of our world play out in real time on the sporting sort of canvas that a
Right.
lot of people might be paying attention to that they might not pay attention to the same way with sort of straight up politics.
And
Yeah.
if I could just tap into that, but I think also what it also offers is the opportunity for those of us at a very local level to tap in. Well, yes, there are 16 different host cities. There's 48 different base camp
Yeah.
areas throughout the three continents, whether it's in the Pacific Northwest, the Northeast, and Kansas City is a big one, and I think, it's an opportunity for local communities to try to engage with the teams who they're hosting, not necessarily for games, but for training camps, right? And I think of, because I've been doing work on the French Football Federation's, they have a women's football diplomacy project with Iraq. So, and when Iraq wound up in their group of death, group for World Cup play, I was keenly keeping an eye on that. And I think of Iraq, which is now base camp in West Virginia. When was the last time that most people in West Virginia were able to have a direct interaction with an Iraqi? Even if they're part of the diaspora who might have been playing in Europe or other parts of the world, that ability, to Ron's point, to have that people to people exchange and connection, and to see that Iraq can also be about things that we also think about, like sports and football. And it's not just about some of the negative things we might read about in the news. And so
Yeah.
that's where I think really at the local level, mega event to the scale of FIFA 2026 offers up a lot of opportunity for individual citizens to be able to seek out these engagements and to try to be a part of it and contribute something of value, even if we don't necessarily have tickets and are going to the matches in person.
Yeah, yeah, this gives us so much. This is just amazing conversation. I'm so glad we're recording. It just gives us a lot to think about as we're enjoying the fun of sports. I mean, sports can be fun, and it is supposed to be fun, but also so much to think about, as we're engaging in something that we all enjoy participating in together. As we close our conversation today, we have a few more moments. After the games are concluded, the last game will be, I'm going to still use MetLife Stadium in New Jersey. That's going to be on July 19th, and there'll be some celebrating, the 20th, the 21st. But the confetti will land. FIFA will turn its attention to the next event. And how when these mega events end, they often they try to leave some sort of a legacy foundation or civic benefactor in those local communities. And so there's lots of ways that the legacy of these games will have that footprint in our 16 cities. And so as we conclude today, what would you want our audience to kind of be watching for in the future? So here locally in Seattle, what should we be looking for in terms of this legacy foundation that the local committee has put into place that will continue to have some sort of a footprint and some sort of civic engagement going forward? What would you recommend that we watch for in terms of that sports diplomacy legacy? And Lindsay, we'll go ahead and start with you, and then Ron, we'll finish with you.
Oh, so I might not be best positioned to talk about the specific Seattle example, but I think overall legacy, and what are the ways that the different host areas, but even not the host areas, right? Just kind of at large, what kind of ways are we able to make the practice and engagement of football or soccer more accessible to those who want to do it, whether they're kids, youth, adults, right? The access issue, the pitch issue, how what is that tangible legacy that might be there to help to grow the game at different levels?
Thank you. Ron?
I completely agree with Lindsay. I think the biggest question is sort of how it builds access. I think a lot of people are going to be focused more on sort of growth on the top end of the game, and I think the more interesting question is growth on the sort of grassroots levels. The Rave Foundation has their 52 mini pitches for 52, seeing how those pitches, which they've built 52 mini pitches across the state of Washington in the last couple of years, seeing how those get activated, how those get used is going to be really crucial, I think. And then to the question of inclusion, I think also the local organizing committee has put a lot of effort into both the Pride match and the Juneteenth match. So the US will be playing here in Seattle on Juneteenth. And so it's an opportunity to tell the world why Juneteenth is necessary, as Leo Fleur likes to say, our chief legacy officer. So I think that's a really significant moment. And then I also think potentially the biggest legacy question for Seattle is women's soccer and the Women's World Cup in 31. And I know that the Seattle Sports Commission and Beth Knox have been working really hard to position Seattle in the ways we were talking earlier as like a recurring host of mega events and maybe sort of, I don't know what the middle meta events, I guess, events that are sort of maybe not quite mega, but still pretty big. That's really sort of a lot of the effort of Seattle is to learn from the experience and take it forward.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing all of that up, Ron. It's and Lindsay, the things that we all can be watching for as we're enjoying the games and when the games have concluded. I just want to wrap us up by saying I could not be happier to spend my time with you all. For those of you that are in the audience, there's so much more to be learned, and we'll be working with World Affairs Council to send an email to you with some additional resources. Ron has some fantastic resources that he's built through the University of Washington's Global Sports Lab. And Lindsay also has an amazing website with incredible resources for anyone who wants to learn more about sports diplomacy and the role of sport in our diplomatic efforts. So I'm just going to close by saying thank you all, and the audience, you'll be receiving some additional information.
Thank you all so much. Really
Thank
enjoyed it.
you.
Thanks.
Appreciate you.